Hi, Chapman. So you told me last time we spoke on Twitter, you told me that I believe that was after the news from the US government seeking to buy up to what, £1 million of uranium.
Yes.
You told me that
Interesting thing.
maybe there was a bull thesis before, but it was sort of a lame thesis, I think is what you called it.
Yeah.
But now there definitely is a bull thesis that's not lame. So do tell, what do you mean? What's up there?
So this has been a project that I've been working on for probably a couple weeks now. And it was mostly started because I needed to, with the bifurcation of production, particularly on the side of uranium enrichment and making it into fuel for reactors, I wanted to come up with an actual production of what would be demand, I wanted to come up with an actual demand projection for what uranium would be required by the OECD and also consequently by Russia and China, which are sort of also two separate spheres as well, because China has reactors that they supply and ergo probably fuel that they will also be supplying. And Russia does the same. If I said it's Russia and China. So having to do that, I also went back because you have to apply these numbers that you're coming up with, these projections, to the past, because you have to test it against the past to see if you're sort of on the right track for the future. So as far as what the bull thesis was, I found out that it was not quite as like dramatic as a lot of people may have expected, and that explains a lot because it never really, as some people might call it, never went to the moon. So you essentially you have all of the excess SWU capacity, and I think I mentioned before in the past that it's just SWU capacity can have incredible effects on how much uranium that you need to actually mine, where basically what's the composition of your total supply of uranium, particularly the feedstock that you push through enrichment and then turn into fuel. The second part of that is also that we've been slightly enriching just a little bit higher, and that means that fuel stays in the reactor longer. So for instance, this has been, you might have heard something called accident tolerant fuels. Well,
Mm.
accident tolerant fuels is sort of the bonus is that it has a higher accident tolerance. But what it's actually there for is to allow for fuels to have a slightly higher enrichment. So for instance, you go from 0.44 enriched uranium to 0.49, let's say, and instead of having 45 gigawatt days per metric ton of fuel, you get like 60 days per 60 gigawatt days per metric ton of fuel. It's quite a huge energy difference. So you go from about a 18-month fuel cycle to something like 22 months potentially. And that's currently, a lot of those accident tolerant fuels are now being deployed. I think Vogel unit number, it's either one or two, have just gotten a new, I think it was maybe sometime last year that they agreed, sometime this year or last year, they agreed to test out these accident tolerant fuels. So that's the other thing that we're going to. So we're essentially sort of getting a bit more out of the uranium that we had been, because the longer that you have the fuel in the reactor for, if you have a higher enrichment, as long as your fuel bundle can basically withstand the reactor environment, like I said, the longer you have it in there, well, the more plutonium 239 that you create. So you eventually, I'm not a nuclear scientist, so help me here. Someone please help me out here if I'm wrong. But essentially, more of your energy starts coming from the plutonium side of things, or you fission off more of that plutonium than you do at a lower grade of enrichment, essentially. Because as your fuel is in the reactor, you'll have more U-238 that will become plutonium 239. So that's that part there. And then eventually I started coming up with figures like total EUP, and you start getting close to figures, and then you come up with how much SWU was dedicated to re-enriching tails, which is very interesting. That was a sort of a source of secondary supply, and that ends up being about 6 kilotons, basically, of fuel that you don't, or basically uranium that you don't have to mine. It's the other interesting part of this. The other thing, the reason this whole overarching thing is why this started, was that the figures that you see from like WNA or IAEA in terms of their projections for total uranium demand are not, they're not there to be like a down to the pound accurate of, like, the IAEA actually said in their 2020 Red Book, they actually adjusted some of their figures down, believe it or not, compared to what they had been saying in the past. For instance, a new reactor, like how much gigawatt days per gigawatt E, essentially, you would get out of tons of fuel. So there was, and they actually seem to, computer stop. Sorry. Where was I? Yes. So they started to have, they seem to actually take a bit more of a study of it, of like how much, what's your actual consumption, what's your actual demand. And they even said that their projections are not based on consumption, but anticipated acquisitions. So this is a little different than consumption. Acquisition you would get for something that you may actually need further out in the future. Interesting. So when I started coming up with the figures, this was before bifurcation of uranium production worldwide, you find that mining was actually like closer to demand, essentially. And that what was happening was that the mining figures were falling to actual demand requirements. Because otherwise, why would mining be falling? That's the other thing that people need to think about here. Like, why was Sput able to buy 53 million pounds on the spot market? If we supposedly were entering basically a supply shortage, why did the utilities and all the fuel buyers just sort of stand by and let that happen? Because it wasn't needed. It was surplus to requirements. And when you start looking at it, you find that, and I would calculate the surplus from 2021 was probably, in terms of like how much mined ore, is probably about, if I think I've got this right in kilograms, I don't know if but let's see, the surplus here, we mined 48.3 kilotons of ore, and that led to a surplus in supply in total of about 5.5 kilotons. So that's crazy. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't a bull thesis. Like you start going through the numbers and you find that, yeah, the demand does rise, but it really doesn't start popping off until about 2024 or 2025. It's interesting. I also found that there's a big rise in demand that's needed that year. Could be because of just how many reactors are coming online. So I found that was interesting. It's like global really focuses on that year, 2025. Why? Well, it's because they want to be able to capture that slice of the market. So as far as like, how many mines would you need, okay, to basically get these figures back up and running? So, and this would happen over, several years, because you don't just flick a magic switch and, wow, you're back at full production. But Cameco coming back to full production, Kazatomprom coming back to full production, Langer Heinrich, Global, and Boss, and you're there for the rest of the decade. It's crazy when you think about it. That's pretty much, that was the old bull thesis. However, so as I'm saying now, the bull thesis is dead. Long live the bull thesis, because without that Russian SWU, I mean, the amount of demand that is required just becomes, it's on several orders of magnitude bigger than I think anyone has like really thought about. I mean, you can and actually, if you throw in Japan restarts, that's when, like, for the OECD, if you start overfeeding to like a 0.4 tails assay, yeah, you can do it. But when you get to the margins at the end of the slew spectrum, as I'd say, as I've sort of found. So if you're at like 0.4 and you add just a tiny bit more demand, I mean, your demands just go way up. So that's what's happening. And the figures for, I would say, it's like you get to figures that are so huge for the next 2 years that you're going to have governments that are potentially, like in the United States, dipping into the HEU stocks. You've got a lot of the British are sitting on a lot of plutonium-239 that can be turned into MOX. So, you know, there's a lot there. And then there's also the component of there's USA demand, there's OECD demand, which I say was Europe, and which also includes the United States, of course. But the thing is that they have a lot of enrichment. Most of the enrichment capacity in the West is in Europe. That's going to be a very fun conversation, because if you have to start supplying the United States with all that centrifuges, because you can't really shut down centrifuges easily, I mean, you know, to retool production. So you kind of want, you know, one tails assay as close as you can get it, from my understanding. And I could be wrong about that, but essentially, if you start supplying the United States, you'd have to use a lot more uranium. So we could be in like a situation where the United States is having to pay the Europeans, basically the French, to basically for a whole bunch of uranium that they don't necessarily need, just for us to get enough uranium for our reactors while we build out SWU capacity. There is, interestingly enough, a fuel conference that's actually coming up here in the next couple of weeks. NEI has seemed to be the one that's organized this. And it's going to be really interesting in that you have everyone's going to be in the same room. Okay. So even 10X, they're actually going to have a representative there. So Centrist is sending representatives. Cameco is sending representatives. Silex will have GLE, the president and COO or whatever of Silex is, well, it will be GLE. They're going to be there. All the utilities are going to be there. And I noticed something kind of interesting in that, and I know I'm rambling on here, sorry. And that is that in addition to all the lawyers and the trade representatives and all the traders that, you know, buy the uranium and, you know, kind of want to know what their future business is going to be, all the utilities that haven't publicly made a decision yet are sending analysts. It's like Southern is sending an analyst in their job titles anyway. And so, for instance, like, let's see here, Entergy, they're sending analysts. PSEG, that's New Jersey, I think. They're sending an analyst. Southern Nuclear, they're sending analysts because they want to know where they're going to go. So they're going to need analysts there. But Duke, who, along with Constellation, have kind of thrown their selves behind Silex as being a source of enrichment. Well, they're just sending, you know, engineers and directors of fuel supply, you know. So that was interesting. It's sort of something, you know, you're kind of gleaming here, like, who's coming, because also the French are coming as well. Like, so Orano is sending like 5 different people. Framantom is sending like 2. Urenco is sending 4. So you have the Europeans, you know, so you have the rest of Europe and Urenco. You have the French and Orano and Framantom. Converdyne's going to be there. And I've sort of divided this up a little bit into like you've got Team Russia, which is Silex and 10X basically, or not, excuse me, is Centrist and 10X. And then you've got Silex Cameco. This was also interesting. Cameco is sending a senior director of finance. Why? Because they need to know how much money they're going to have to put up to build GLE at Paducah, as their partner. It's just really interesting. It's just so you just find a lot of interesting things. To be on the fly on the wall in this conference would be fantastic. But we may find out, I don't think we're going to find out what DOE's fuel plans are, what they're going to propose to Congress. We might get some hints as to where they're going, but you sort of need everybody in the same room before you come up with a plan that you then want to present to Congress. And this is where I think this is going to be decided. Or DOE is going to sort of take everybody's advice. You also have miners there as well. So you have Peninsula, Quad U, Energy Fuels, URG, and even Western Uranium and Vanadium is going to be there. But it's not a huge contingent of miners, so that's interesting. But so this was something that Clay Montgomery, I think Montgomery is his last name, pointed out, and I was started going through, and I'm like, okay, who's going, and just trying to glean whatever I could from that. So,
sure. What do you think this new Bull Thesis 2.0? What are the characteristics? Like, when do you think it's going to play out? Because you say it didn't go, uranium didn't go to the moon, but if you start looking at some of the prices in like 2016, compare them to 2020, some of those stocks, global has done a 20x, right? So surely something has played out already. The price is up a little bit. Now, obviously, it's not $100 where I guess a lot of us would have expected it to be. But so this Bull Thesis, when does it start? Where does it go? How long does it go on for? What are your projections?
So if you have an aggressive Japan restart, that's when things get a little bit dicey, because you're going to be really pushing the limits of potential supply there. It doesn't, a new Bull Thesis doesn't really cool off until you have your slew capacity fully built out. In the United States, I would say we would need to add a minimum of probably at least 22 million SWU, at least. Preferably, if we're going to be supplying Japan, probably, maybe even 30 would be nice. Simply because, you go back to the days like before the megatons to megawatts program. You had 2 gaseous diffusion plants running in the United States. And, Japan hadn't fully built out just yet. So this was like 70s, 80s, when we were basically enriching all of our own stuff. So I think that it's going to take a while. We're going to find out just how quickly, enrichment can be built, how quickly laser enrichment can be built, if laser enrichment actually happens. So it really doesn't. It's going to be a really active market until probably, I would say 2028 is when it settles down. But within about at least a year, once this fuel plan comes out, and once it starts becoming known as to just how much uranium is going to be needed, because again, the utilities are not going to contract for new U3O8 until they know how much they actually need. So that is.
So that's when you think that the bull run is actually going to start, once they start contracting.
Mm-hmm.
But for them to start contracting, they're going to have to know how much they're going to need. But right, they're also sooner or later going to run out of fuel. I talked to Jim Pelchat, nuclear engineer. He seems to have his finger on the pulse somewhat on this. And he told me that it's not going to be too long. He spoke about, what did he say, like 3 to 10 months or something like that?
Simply put, there's not going to be enough uranium for them to basically maintain fuel stocks. Mm-hmm. So what's going to happen is that you're going to have that down blended of HEU. And essentially, there's been some theorizing in people that care about this, like me and a couple of other people, that that will be potentially a carrot to sign up to the program for DOE to maintain control. I'm not so sure. I think it's going to be, this is sort of it's hugely embarrassing for DOE, and they've done a very good job of keeping this under wraps, because in the United States, I mean, we're talking about basically 20% of the electricity. No one is talking about this at all, that there is a potential for running out of fuel, which is, you would think that, if we're talking about gas prices, well, let's talk about 20% of the electricity going offline. Potentially, I mean, they're not going to have all these reactors go offline, but I mean, it's going to kind of close. So,
but okay, so when but if we try and be more specific, if you've done some calculations on when you expect that to start happening, and based on your projections for supply, how far could the price of uranium run?
Figuring out how high it's going to go is difficult, because it's the best part of it. If you're trying to figure out how high it's going to run, I mean, I think that's sort of secondary to figuring out how many new mines are actually going to be needed.
Okay, but how long is it going to run for? Maybe that's a better question. Like,
how
long does it take from here to go to a number of produced pounds that equals the demand? Meaning, how long does it take for producers from now on to close the potential supply gap?
How long does it take? I mean, it's going to take at least 5 to 7 years of bringing, because you're going to have to bring new mines online,
right?
Like,
so in those 5 to 7 years, the price can go anywhere.
That's correct.
If there's a supply deficit in those 5 to 7 years, if you're a utility doing like 1 million in potential losses a day, and then you have upkeep of your reactor when it's offline, you're not going to keep that reactor offline for too long. You're going to pay up the price, right? Am I seeing this wrong?
I mean, you're either going to get an emergency supply of fuel through the HEU downblending. We're going to find out how quickly you have one cycle of that worth of that. You could fuel without the HEU stocks. I think you could do about one fuel cycle refuel of that. The British have a lot of plutonium-239 that can be made at MOX. So like I said, maybe we're going to be finding out just how quickly MOX can be made. But US reactors are not necessarily certified to run MOX. They can, of course, but you've got operators that are not certified in MOX fuel potentially. So there's going to be some bureaucratic headaches there. But am I answering the question? Because it was like, how long is this going to go on for, really? Or
pretty much what it comes down to. I'm just trying to figure out the characteristics of this new Bull thesis, because you call it Bull thesis 2.0. So I'm just wondering, the first thesis was kind of simpler. We sort of, you have an exit plan more or less, but like, when does this start? How far does it go? How long does it run for? I guess those are the three main things that I want to know.
It will really start later this year.
This year?
Oh yeah, once the needs are known, essentially everything will be out there in the open, probably within a couple of months at least, at the very longest, I would say.
Do you think it's going to coincide with the event that you talked about earlier?
Probably not. I don't think we may get some tidbits out of there, but we're not really, because this is such a huge thing in terms of DOE doing something with enrichment, that they're going to have to go before Congress. So it would be presumption on them to say, like, hey, this is what we're going to do, because you don't know what Congress is going to be willing to do. We're kind of a bit behind the 8 ball there, because it's I mean, you don't, it's enrichment technology is sort of a landmine of, because it's the enrichment side of things is something that is just like uh, you start dealing with the proliferation side of it potentially, and that's that's a whole can of worms. But it's, I mean, yeah, we are actually in a situation where if something isn't done, the lights will be going out. So it's, and it's the more important thing.
So hold on a second. Your
No.
Uranium Bull Thesis 2.0 is coming to the conclusion that Rick Roll said either the price of uranium goes up or the lights go out. But
Yeah,
you're
it's actually,
saying
that's actually happening now. Like
exactly.
it wasn't really what the difference between this bull thesis and old bull thesis was that yes, the price of uranium needed to go up to get Cameco and Paladin, Longer Heinrich, Boss, all those mines incentive to come online. Yes, you're now going to need more mines because at least for the foreseeable future, you're basically cutting off the world of, in the West, we have 27.1 million SWU. There's only about 4.7 of it in the United States. In a total of about 67.7 million SWU worldwide. So we have 70% of the reactors in the OECD, the West. We have 40% thereabout of the SWU capacity. Obviously, this has been a mismatch that we're now dealing with the consequences of. And it's mostly just because the OECD has been treating nuclear for the past 20 years like the bastard stepchild of energy choices. And it's mostly like, oh yeah, we're just going to get our SWU from Russia. Who cares? Nobody really sat down to think about that. That maybe,
So that's the most important thing in the new Uranium Bull Thesis. Then that's the
SWU capacity.
The SWU capacity is like the biggest.
This also it's you have actually it's almost like quadricated actually of SWU capacity worldwide, because you've got China, they do their own thing. China has a very sensible policy of sort of handling as much of their fuel cycle within their borders as they can. Very smart. Then you have the Russian SWU capacity, which is, they have most of it. Like if any country has the amount of SWU capacity, then you'll have Europe, because Europe will be able to more adequately supply their needs with their own SWU capacity without having to resort to overfeeding, believe it or not. I don't believe, because they have 21 or something like that when you subtract it out. For basically their reactors, but the United States, we have 4.7. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation with the Europeans, because you're going to have to be running at a potentially much higher assay on your tails, which means you're going to have a lot more fuel. Now, because you can't really step down, what are you going to have? Like, you're going to have a production run just in the United States, and you're just going to completely retool your centrifuges for, Europe and the rest of the OECD. Okay, sure. And then you throw Japan into the mix, and it's like, oh God, that's when if Japan is like the bonus on this, that makes everything just go like, if you have Japan, you actually can't, you end up having to actually combine SWU, because it's just impossible otherwise. So, without any added SWU, I punch up this number here real quick. So this year, I have Japan's restart staggered over 3 years, essentially.
Have the EU taxonomy somehow implemented in there?
The EU taxonomy, that's an interesting one, in that it's not really changing. It's not going to bring any more reactors online in the near term.
Not in the near term, but eventually.
Yeah, eventually, yeah, that's a different. I'm not going beyond 2030. That's the thing at the moment, anyway. And this is sort of stage. I guess I could step back for a second. This is sort of stage one of what I'm coming up with. Coming with basically the maximum potential demand, and then I'll have secondary supply factors that you can have, like where can you get, like, this is your total uranium that you need. Okay, well, you can also get uranium from HEU, you can get it from MOX fuels, you can get it from stockpiles as well. So, you start adding that in, and that's sort of stage two, essentially, of this calculation. Then you come up with a more accurate, totally accurate figure. So, like, for instance, if you have like Western SWU with Japan, I mean, your total feedstock is like, you would have to mine effectively, it looks about to be about like 57, if I'm, yeah, that's about right. It's about 57.6 kilotons of ore. Well, that's
last year we mined 48, I believe.
Yeah, last year we mined 48. The record is the near-term record is 2016, which was 63. And eventually, the global record annually worldwide is like 70 kilotons. It's supported.
So production's got to increase by like 30% from last year's levels.
Eventually, yeah, it's going to have to get there, and it's going to have to get there fairly quickly.
And it's not only production, but it's also SWU capacity.
Yeah, SWU capacity is going to, well, I mean, as SWU capacity comes online, this is also this is the secondary thing, So as SWU capacity comes online, your demand in the OECD will go down rather sharply, but demand is going to be so high that, you may still have to have a mine that's going to come online. Like, so for instance, you've got this mine ramping up, and then that mine ramps up to this point, as things moving up. But this is something really important to know, because you could be ending up investing in mines that are not, even now, I mean, you'll have mines that will be surplus to requirement. I mean, almost certainly NXE is getting developed at this point. They probably might even be speeding up the process.
So what is because I know that you got to go here in like 3 minutes or so, because you got your Twitter Spaces.
Yes.
What's the conclusion? Not bearish?
Definitely not bearish. No. Oh God, no. It's more bullish than it has ever been.
So there
is an actual bull thesis now. I will go out there and say that, because the old bull thesis was you just return mines back up to full production. Essentially, you come back to what you have in like 2015.
Yeah, I gotta say, it wasn't a bad bull thesis, because if you had to ramp up production while there was a supply deficit,
you only had a couple mines that you could invest in. Like, you didn't need any of the explorers.
But a rising tide, picks up all boats, or whatever. Saying it. So,
but I don't think that was quite understood at the time, or it wasn't understood that there wasn't actually like coming up with a figure for how much is needed.
Right.
So it's definitely, it's going to start here very soon. I mean, it will know, like, once you have an idea of a plan for how much SWU capacity is going to be added. Then but the next 2 years, it's almost like you're going to have to be dipping into those stockpiles, because the numbers are just so big. So
okay. So when you say that it's going to start real soon, do you mean that the contracting is going to start real soon, and the long-term contracting price is going to start moving real soon, or what do you mean?
I would say, yeah. I mean, you would have, once you have an idea of how much SWU capacity is going to be online, say 3 or 4 years from now, well, yeah, you're going to start contracting for uranium that you need 4 years from now. So once you have that figure, then you will be contracting for it, and that will happen probably this fall, if I had to guess.
Okay. Yeah.
So there you go.
I'm gonna let you go now. I guess we could keep talking for hours. You're doing amazing work. So I'm really thankful
publishing
for
this on Substack here soon. So, and I've got all my figures. Everybody can go over them. Please, someone tell me.
Please do. Yeah, that's why that's why you're putting this out there, right? That's why I want to talk to you, give you a platform to put it out there. If somebody catches a mistake, or if maybe somebody says like it was a mistake, it's
I've run
actually
this
going to be
by nuclear engineers, and like
okay.
saying, like, coming up like, help me please, like, and my figures are correct here. Yeah. So it's pretty close. Again, I'm not going to get to the down to the pound of an accuracy, but if I can get within a kiloton, I'll be really happy. So
no, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah.
All right, Chapman, thank you for doing this.
Talk to you later.